Pregnant wife leaves millionaire after catching him with mistress years later. He regrets it. In a quiet neighborhood tucked behind rows of manicured hedges, Elizabeth Marciano seemed destined for a storybook life. She was a graceful beauty and the wife of a rising millionaire, Alexander Marciano, an ambitious entrepreneur who had conquered the real estate world before his 30th birthday. But behind closed doors, the glossy perfection was beginning to crumble. Newly pregnant, Elizabeth was preparing for the arrival of their first child. She believed she and Alexander had it all: success, luxury, and a fairy tale love. Little did she know that one discovery, a single moment of betrayal, would shatter everything. Her heart would break, her world would tilt, and soon nothing would ever be the same. Elizabeth Barnes, who would later become Elizabeth Marciano, was raised in a modest home on the outskirts of Houston, Texas. Her parents worked honest jobs. Her father, Jacob, managed a small auto repair shop, while her mother, Teresa, taught piano lessons from their living room. Despite not having much, the Barnes family exuded warmth, generosity, and a near magical sense of optimism. Elizabeth's childhood was filled with music, the cheerful ring of a piano's keys accompanying family dinners, and the smell of roasted vegetables mingling with notes of holiday tunes. Alexander Marciano emerged from a starkly different world. Born in Miami to Alberto Marciano, a self-made real estate magnate, and Camila, a socialite with roots in Spanish aristocracy, Alexander was used to five-star hotels, exclusive boarding schools, and the finer things in life. While handsome, charismatic, and undeniably intelligent, Alexander also carried a sense of entitlement born from unending privilege. Yet he was determined to build his own empire, separate from his father's considerable shadow. It was at a charity gala in downtown Houston, hosted by a mutual acquaintance, Thomas Gallagher, that Alexander and Elizabeth first locked eyes. Elizabeth, a novice in the glitz and glamour of high society, arrived awkwardly in a simple black gown, but her radiant smile and natural grace immediately caught Alexander's attention. He found himself drawn to her gentle charm, a stark contrast to the polished vanity he was used to. That night, sparks flew, phone numbers were exchanged, and a new chapter of both their lives began. Their first date was at a small bistro on the outskirts of the city, away from paparazzi or high society gawkers. Alexander, who typically dined at Michelin-star restaurants, surprised Elizabeth by suggesting they explore her world. He wore a casual navy polo and chinos, looking almost ordinary, yet still undeniably confident in his posture and speech. Over plates of pasta and a shared tiramisu, Elizabeth felt an instant connection to this sophisticated man who had glimpses of vulnerability. He spoke about wanting to create something of his own, a real estate portfolio that was distinct from his father's domain. Elizabeth was touched by his determination to forge his own path, rather than simply ride his family's coattails. In the subsequent months, their relationship blossomed, fueled by intense passion, a shared sense of adventure, and the thrill of new beginnings. Alexander introduced Elizabeth to swanky social circles, while she showed him the hidden charm of quiet neighborhoods and unpretentious local markets. They traveled to Rome together, strolled hand in hand through the cobblestone streets, and spent romantic nights talking about their dreams. Within a year, Alexander had purchased his first major property in Dallas, flipping it for an impressive profit. Fueled by that success, he poured his energy into expanding his reach to Austin, San Antonio, and even parts of California. As his fortunes soared, he spared no expense in pampering Elizabeth vintage wines, romantic ski trips to Aspen, and a diamond necklace that seemed to catch light from every corner of a room. Despite the whirlwind of excitement and affluence, Elizabeth remained grounded. She continued volunteering at local charities, never losing sight of the modest values instilled in her by her parents. It was precisely this combination of humility and quiet strength that made Alexander propose to her just before her 25th birthday. Their wedding took place at a sprawling estate in Napa Valley. Rows of lavender-laden tables and strings of twinkling fairy lights set the ambience under a pastel evening sky. Friends and family flew in from all over, with Thomas Gallagher, ever the connector, beaming at the front row, proud to have played matchmaker. Elizabeth wore a satin gown that accentuated her elegant figure, her long curls tumbling down in soft waves around her shoulders. Alexander, clad in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, could hardly take his eyes off her. The ceremony itself was a storybook affair, officiated by Father Anthony Delgado, who had christened many children in the Marciano family. He spoke eloquently of the devotion and patience that make a marriage endure. Elizabeth teared up as she said her vows, promising to stand by Alexander through riches and ruin, in sickness and in health. For his part, Alexander, typically suave and collected, paused more than once, choked by emotion he had rarely allowed himself to feel in public. As they exchanged rings, glistening bands of white gold, they symbolized not just a union of hearts, but a merging of two very distinct worlds. Afterward, the reception was a lavish feast. Tables overflowed with fresh oysters, artisanal cheeses, and delicately crafted pastries. The wine flowed freely, a spectacular Cabernet from a nearby vineyard, personally approved by Alexander's father, Alberto, who watched from the sidelines with a mixture of pride and longing. Over the years, Alberto and Alexander had navigated a turbulent father-son relationship, but that evening it seemed all was forgiven as he gave a toast, praising his son's achievements and extolling Elizabeth's warmth. As dancing commenced under the stars, Elizabeth and Alexander shared a slow waltz that seemed to last an eternity, just long enough for them to believe their happiness might be permanent. The moon lit their path, and Elizabeth, head resting on Alexander's broad shoulder, felt secure in the arms of her brand-new husband. The night ended with them vanishing into a vintage Rolls-Royce that would whisk them away to a 5-star resort for their honeymoon, the guests still clinking glasses behind them. Back from their honeymoon in Bora Bora, the Marcianos moved into a luxurious villa in River Oaks, an upscale enclave in Houston. Designed by a renowned architect, every inch of the property dripped with opulence: marble floors, a grand staircase with intricately wrought iron railings, and glass walls overlooking manicured gardens. Yet, for Elizabeth, the true joy came from imagining the love and family memories they might create within those walls, rather than the splendor itself. Alexander's ambitions, however, soared higher with each financial success. He began to spend more and more time away, late nights in the office, business trips that popped up last minute, meetings with foreign investors who demanded his presence in distant cities. Initially, Elizabeth accepted these absences as part of building a business empire. After all, his drive and talent had always been part of what attracted her. But it was during one of these prolonged trips to New York that Elizabeth felt the first faint stirrings of concern. Alexander's messages had become sporadic, his tone sometimes distant. He was collaborating with a new partner, Vanessa Simmons, a shrewd deal-maker known for turning underperforming properties into gold mines. Elizabeth tried not to let jealousy creep in, reminding herself that it was normal for Alexander to connect with experts in his field. Yet, a nagging worry took root. When he finally returned, exhaustion tugged at his features, and Elizabeth found him more irritable than usual. He snapped at trivial matters: a misplaced set of keys, the phone ringing during dinner. A subtle tension hung in the air, something intangible and inexplicable, Although Alexander apologized each time, claiming stress and anxiety, Elizabeth's instincts sensed a gap forming between them. Still, moments of warmth persisted. One night, he surprised her with a bouquet of her favorite pink peonies and a heartfelt note. "I'm building all this for our future. Trust me, everything I do for us." Touched by his gesture, Elizabeth tried to bury her unease. She allowed herself to believe that their story remained a romantic fairy tale, and that any small tear in the fabric of their marriage would be mended with time and communication. Then, a life-changing event occurred that shifted Elizabeth's focus entirely. She discovered she was pregnant. Finding out she was pregnant filled Elizabeth with an electrifying blend of joy and apprehension. She'd long dreamed of having children being raised in a loving, close-knit family. She yearned to pass on those same values to her own offspring. She prepared a small box with baby booties and an ultrasound image to give to Alexander as her way of announcing the news. Alexander's reaction was, at first, pure excitement. He lifted her in his arms and spun her around, exclaiming that they would soon have a little Marciano to carry on the family legacy. For a few weeks, the tension that had brewed between them vanished. He placed gentle hands on her belly each morning, whispered sweet words to the unborn child, and even started mapping out plans for a lavish nursery. But as the pregnancy symptoms intensified, morning sickness, fatigue, and a roller coaster of emotions, Elizabeth needed Alexander more than ever. Yet, ironically, his schedule grew even more demanding. He was closing a massive business deal in Los Angeles, then jetting to Chicago for a groundbreaking ceremony. His phone calls were often cut short, text messages sparse, and sometimes cold. Elizabeth tried her best to be supportive, reminding herself that they were on the cusp of extraordinary business growth. She confided her loneliness to her best friend, Helen Russo, who had known Elizabeth since childhood. Over coffee and muffins, Helen raised a gentle caution. "Remember, Liz, love is about presence as much as it is about ambition. Don't let him forget you need him now." Elizabeth nodded, tears threatening to spill over, but she forced herself to remain optimistic. Alexander had always proven he cared. He just had a monumental dream to achieve, and she believed her role was to stand firmly by his side, trusting that once the frenzy subsided, he would be there for her and the baby completely. Around the 5th month of her pregnancy, Elizabeth started noticing unsettling changes in Alexander's behavior. He was often glued to his phone, smiling at text messages he didn't care to share, and stepping out of the room for hushed phone calls. The nights he worked late became more frequent, and weekends, once reserved for them, transformed into important networking events that demanded his attendance. Additionally, his temper flared easily. He grew irritated if Elizabeth asked questions about business or expressed worry over how little time they spent together. Once, after she gently inquired about an upcoming trip, he snapped, "Why can't you trust me for once? I'm doing this for us, for the baby. Stop suffocating me." Guilt gnawed at Elizabeth. She wondered if her heightened emotions were part of the pregnancy, making her more sensitive than usual. She resolved to give Alexander the benefit of the doubt. One evening, Elizabeth decided to surprise Alexander at his downtown office with a homemade meal chicken casserole and freshly baked bread, staples from her childhood. She arrived to find the building dark. Confused, she checked her phone. Alexander had texted her earlier that he would be pulling an all-nighter. With quiet dread in her heart, she ascended to his floor, expecting at least to see lights on. Instead, only a faint glow from a lamp in a corner office cut through the darkness. Yet, upon entering Alexander's spacious office, he was nowhere to be found. The faint smell of expensive cologne and something vaguely floral lingered in the air. A lone wine glass sat on his polished desk. Another, half-filled, had been set aside on the coffee table. 2 glasses. Elizabeth's mind whirled with possibilities. Maybe it was just a business associate, a client, or a consultant. But a distinct pang of suspicion told her there was more to it. She left the casserole on the desk with a handwritten note, thought you could use a home-cooked meal. "I love you, Alexander," and forced herself to leave. On her drive home, rain splashed violently against the windshield, mirroring the churning storm inside her. For the first time, she found herself wondering, could he be seeing someone else? As Elizabeth's due date inched closer, the tension between husband and wife escalated. Her sleepless nights weren't just due to the baby's restless kicking, but also her own swirling thoughts. She felt a hollow space in her bed whenever Alexander sneaked in at ungodly hours or didn't show up until dawn. Desperate for reassurance, she tried to talk to him about her fears, about wanting to feel safe and cherished in the final weeks of her pregnancy. But each attempt only seemed to widen the gap. Alexander, for his part, grew cagey. He insisted he was under crushing pressure to close deals before the baby came. He claimed that any sign of a faltering front would jeopardize crucial investors' confidence. But the heartbreak in his eyes, mixed with hints of evasive guilt, made Elizabeth question if he was really drowning in work or if something else was unfolding behind the scenes. One afternoon, while Alexander was away, Elizabeth received an unexpected phone call from Thomas Gallagher, the mutual friend who had introduced them at that fateful charity gala. Hesitant, Thomas asked, "Have you seen the headlines?" Confused, Elizabeth scanned gossip sites, only to find a blurry paparazzi photo that purportedly showed Alexander getting into a limousine with a mysterious brunette. The headline read, "Real estate mogul's late-night rendezvous, is it business or pleasure?" Though tabloids often fabricate stories, Elizabeth was unsettled by the timing. When she confronted Alexander about the photo, he dismissed it as nonsense. "The media will do anything for a scandal. Don't believe a word of it," he insisted. And he was skilled in persuasion, enough to plant a seed of doubt in her own instincts. Still, Elizabeth decided that once the baby arrived, she would no longer endure half-truths. She resolved to uncover the reality lurking in the shadows, but first she had to bring a healthy child into this world. In the midst of all this turmoil, Elizabeth went into labor a week earlier than expected. Late one night, she felt sharp pains in her lower abdomen. Alone in the grand villa, she tried to reach Alexander, only to be directed to voicemail. In a frenzy, Elizabeth called Helen Russo, who rushed her to the hospital. Doctors hurried her into the delivery room, hooking her up to monitors that measured every jolt and contraction. Alexander eventually arrived, looking disheveled and guilty. He had a perfunctory excuse about a business dinner running late, but Elizabeth was too focused on the physical ordeal to question him. Hours turned into an exhausting marathon of pain and anticipation. Finally, at dawn, a piercing cry cut through the hospital corridor, and the nurse placed a beautiful baby girl in Elizabeth's trembling arms. Tears of relief and joy streamed down her face. Alexander stood by her side, awe momentarily softening his features. He kissed Elizabeth's forehead, whispering, "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I'll be better, I promise." In that moment, all the tension dissolved for Elizabeth. The sight of their newborn daughter, whom they named Sophia, felt like a fresh start, a reason to put any doubts behind them and focus on building a future together. For the next few days, Elizabeth basked in the euphoria of motherhood. Alexander even rearranged some of his meetings to spend time at the hospital, holding little Sophia and marveling at her every tiny gesture. This was what Elizabeth had dreamed of, a family united by love. She silently prayed that the birth of their daughter would anchor Alexander's wandering heart, bridging the gap that had been growing between them. Though Sophia's arrival initially drew Alexander closer, it wasn't long before old patterns resurfaced. Less than a month after the baby's birth, Alexander flew to London for a crucial meeting with an international investment group. Elizabeth, still recovering from childbirth and trying to adapt to night feedings and constant diaper changes, felt overwhelmed. She needed Alexander's support more than ever, yet once again he was gone. The staff at the villa, housekeepers, a cook, a nanny, provided assistance, but it wasn't the same as having her husband's presence. Elizabeth felt a pang of envy when she saw how the nanny, Carla, sometimes rocked Sophia to sleep. She yearned to share these precious moments with Alexander. At times, while pacing the nursery floor, baby in her arms, she could nearly feel an invisible barrier between her and the shimmering wealth around her, a gilded cage, more isolating than comforting. Phone calls to Alexander were brief, often cut short by his claims of another meeting starting in 2 minutes. Once, during a video call, Elizabeth saw an unfamiliar reflection in the background, a woman's silhouette passing quickly behind him. He abruptly ended the call, leaving Elizabeth with her stomach clenched and her mind plagued by worst-case scenarios. When he finally returned from his trip, Elizabeth noticed a faint lipstick stain on the collar of his shirt, pale pink, definitely not her brand. In the past, she might have confronted him immediately, but something in her had grown weary. She was drained from caring for Sophia, surviving on minimal sleep, and silently grappling with Alexander's steady drift from their marriage. Instead of a dramatic confrontation, she quietly stored the shirt away as a painful reminder, her suspicions mounting like bricks in a wall of heartbreak. In the weeks that followed, Alexander's approach to fatherhood became more detached. He used Sophia's late-night cries as an excuse to stay in a separate guest room, citing exhaustion from work stress. The once loving father who had caressed Elizabeth's belly was now retreating, both physically and emotionally. Despite the illusions of grandeur around them, Elizabeth began to sense that their union was unraveling by the day. The day Elizabeth's world, cracked beyond repair, began innocently enough. She had a rare opportunity to treat herself to a spa session, Helen's gift, to help her unwind. After a soothing massage and a quick manicure, Elizabeth returned to the villa in the late afternoon, expecting to find Alexander at a meeting and the nanny tending to Sophia. Yet the moment she walked through the foyer, she sensed something amiss. The house was too quiet, and an unfamiliar perfume, heavy with musky undertones, hung in the air. Ascending the grand staircase, Elizabeth heard hushed laughter echo from one of the guest suites. Her heart hammered as she crept closer. The door was ajar, and she could make out Alexander's unmistakable voice, low and intimate. Peeking through the crack, Elizabeth's fears materialized into a horrifying truth. There, sprawled across the crisp white sheets, was Alexander, locked in a passionate embrace with Vanessa Simmons, the shrewd businesswoman rumored to be his new partner. Time seemed to distort, the sounds of their laughter twisting into a grotesque echo in Elizabeth's ears. She had confronted 1,000 versions of this possibility in her mind, but nothing compared to the soul-crushing reality of the scene before her. Her vision blurred with tears. She jerked the door open, surprising the lovers mid-kiss. They scrambled, tangling in the sheets. Alexander's face paled as he registered his wife's presence in the doorway. Vanessa clutched the duvet to her chest, eyes wide with both fear and defiance. In that moment, a suffocating silence filled the corridor. Elizabeth couldn't breathe. She felt the weight of betrayal pressing on her lungs, tears burning hot against her cheeks. She knew there was no going back. With trembling hands, she stumbled away, down the staircase, ignoring Alexander's frantic calls of wait. Everything was a blur, the shimmering marble floors, the gilded mirrors, the crystal chandeliers overhead. The lavish house that once symbolized shared dreams had become a tomb for her broken heart. Elizabeth locked herself in the bedroom, her sobs echoing in the emptiness. Outside, she could hear Alexander's desperate knocking, begging her to listen. But she remained silent, feeling both fury and despair swirl inside her like a violent storm. The very man she had trusted, the father of her newborn daughter, had betrayed her in the most intimate and cruel way. Eventually, Alexander coaxed her into letting him in. Eyes red and voice shaking, he tried to offer explanations. He blamed stress, loneliness, the pressures of maintaining his success. He insisted that Vanessa meant nothing to him, that it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, in a moment of vulnerability. But to Elizabeth, his words rang hollow. The memory of them entwined on the bed was too vivid, too raw. She was consumed by thoughts of the months she spent alone, pregnant with their child, waiting for him to come home at indecent hours. Every suspicion she had tried to bury now erupted like a volcano, scorching away whatever traces of affection or trust lingered in her heart. No apology, no half-baked confession could patch what he had shattered. Exhausted from crying, Elizabeth managed to say only one sentence that night: "I can't believe you did this to our family." In response, Alexander reached out to hold her, but she pulled away. She found herself physically recoiling from his touch, the memory of Vanessa's perfume still clinging to his skin. With trembling resolve, she realized that the only thing she needed now was to protect herself and their daughter from any further damage. If Alexander had chosen to tarnish their marriage, then she would choose to walk away, no matter the cost. Without warning, Elizabeth left the next morning. She packed a few essentials for herself and Sophia: diapers, baby clothes, and a minimal set of her own wardrobe. The staff watched in stunned silence as she carried the infant in a small carrier, loaded her belongings into a taxi, and disappeared beyond the ornate iron gates of the villa. Over the next few days, Alexander bombarded her phone with calls and text messages, professing regret and pleading for another chance. Elizabeth, still raw from the betrayal, refused to engage. She headed straight to Helen Rousseau's modest apartment, where she found a comforting refuge. Helen offered a spare room, cramped but cozy, where Elizabeth could nurse Sophia and grieve in peace. During those days, the weight of heartbreak was crushing, yet Elizabeth also discovered an unexpected strength within herself. She recognized that the glitzy life she had led was inextricably tied to Alexander's money. She had no illusions about how difficult the road ahead would be, especially with a newborn in tow, but she was determined to stand on her own feet, relying on the values her parents had instilled in her: resilience, honesty, and love. With Helen's support, Elizabeth began consulting a lawyer about her legal options. While the Marciano fortune was vast, Elizabeth insisted that all she wanted was enough child support to care for Sophia. She refused to become entangled in a bitter money battle. Emotional exhaustion was her constant companion, but she pressed on, drawing strength from the sight of Sophia's sleepy smiles and tiny, trusting eyes. Before long, she found a small apartment to rent, a far cry from the sprawling mansion in River Oaks. Still, it was her space, a sanctuary free from lies and betrayal. And that, for Elizabeth, was priceless. Life as a single mother wasn't easy, especially after leaving a millionaire husband. Elizabeth realized the scope of her financial vulnerability within weeks of living in her modest one-bedroom apartment. Diaper costs, pediatric appointments, and groceries quickly added up. Without Alexander's unlimited funds, she found herself budgeting meticulously for the first time in years. To create a sense of financial stability, Elizabeth took on freelance work as a social media consultant for a local non-profit, an organization she'd once volunteered with. She spent late nights in front of a laptop, designing campaigns and crafting posts, while Sophia slept in a bassinet next to her. Every so often, the baby would wake, and Elizabeth would feed her, hum soft lullabies, then get back to typing. This juggling act was relentless, but it filled Elizabeth with a quiet sense of pride. She was using her own skills, forging her own path. Alexander continued his attempts to contact her. He left voicemails filled with regret, text messages promising he had ended things with Vanessa. Sometimes he showed up unannounced at her apartment building, only to be turned away by her resolute refusal to see him. On one occasion, Elizabeth did speak to him briefly through a chained door, stating clearly that she needed space to heal. He offered her a larger sum of money and a better apartment, but she declined. She wanted to live by her own means, even if it meant struggling. Meanwhile, bits of gossip trickled in through social circles. Vanessa had allegedly moved on to a new venture in Los Angeles. Rumors circulated that Alexander had ended their affair, though some said it was Vanessa who had cast him aside now that his image was tarnished. Elizabeth chose not to dwell on these rumors. Her focus was on rebuilding her life, not scanning tabloids for the latest scandal. In the back of her mind, she remained haunted by memories of the betrayal, but each day she grew more resolute. She told herself that one day her pain would transform into strength. If Alexander truly regretted his actions, it was now his burden to carry, not hers. Within a few months, Elizabeth's parents, Jacob and Teresa Barnes, flew to Houston to visit her and meet their granddaughter, Sophia. They had been horrified to learn of the betrayal, but offered unconditional support. Their gentle presence in the cramped apartment was a balm to Elizabeth's wounded spirit. Jacob helped with household repairs, installing a safer lock on the door and childproofing the cabinets, while Teresa cooked homemade meals that filled the small space with the aroma of nostalgia. For a moment, the heartbreak subsided. Surrounded by the simple joys of her family, Elizabeth felt gratitude overshadow her resentment. Yet nights were still difficult. She occasionally woke from nightmares in which she saw Alexander's face twisted in guilt, or she replayed the moment she found him with Vanessa. Reminders of her old life lurked everywhere. The designer dresses in her closet she would never wear again, the diamond ring she kept tucked away in a jewelry box. Alexander made repeated attempts to see Sophia, but Elizabeth asked him to coordinate visits through her lawyer. She believed they needed boundaries. If he truly cared about his daughter, he would respect the conditions. Initially, he railed against these demands, calling them unfair. But as time wore on, his tone grew more subdued and apologetic. Jacob confronted Alexander once, an uncomfortable meeting at the lawyer's office. He demanded to know why Alexander had thrown away the best thing that ever happened to him. Visibly shaken, Alexander could only stammer that he had made a grave mistake. Jacob, with a father's fierce protectiveness, merely responded, "My daughter deserves better," and left it at that. In these tumultuous months, Elizabeth discovered layers of resilience she never realized she had. Each day she inched forward, determined to carve out a new life for herself and Sophia, no matter the challenges. Business rumors swirled that Alexander's empire wasn't as untouchable as it once seemed. A number of key investors had pulled out, alarmed by the negative publicity tied to his scandal. Deals that were nearly sealed unraveled at the last minute, and the real estate market cooled. As the economy shifted, Alexander felt the brunt of a downturn colliding with his tarnished reputation. At first, he tried to power through it, doubling his work hours, traveling incessantly to drum up new partnerships. But the chain of misfortunes didn't relent. A major project in Chicago failed to secure necessary permits, causing heavy financial losses. A second deal, set in Miami, fell apart when the investors withdrew, spooked by talk of Alexander's perceived instability. Debt accumulated faster than profits. Alberto, Alexander's father, stepped in, offering a bailout under one condition: Alexander must return to Miami and rejoin the family enterprise on Alberto's terms. The proposition cut Alexander's pride to the core. He had always claimed he would succeed on his own. without riding his father's coattails. Accepting the offer felt like a personal failure. But he was desperate. The empire he had built so meticulously was crumbling around him like a house of cards. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his penthouse office, Alexander sipped whiskey and stared at a photo on his desk. It was of Elizabeth, pregnant and smiling, her hand resting gently on her belly. Next to her stood Alexander, looking triumphant, his arms wrapped protectively around her. The image struck him like a knife to the heart. Here he was, once the golden boy of real estate, reduced to drowning in regret and self-loathing. His thoughts drifted to Sophia, the daughter he barely saw. Guilt consumed him. He realized how blind he had been, placing business expansion and fleeting temptations above the love he once cherished. Memories of that day in the guest suite haunted him, the shock and pain etched on Elizabeth's face as she caught him. He had committed the ultimate betrayal and wrecked the life they were supposed to share. In that moment, Alexander admitted to himself that no sum of money or professional triumph could replace the warmth of family he had lost. He felt an ache for redemption, but he wasn't sure if redemption was even possible anymore. By this point, Elizabeth's freelance work had grown more stable, and she began to build a small clientele for her social media consulting. With each new contract, she felt a surge of confidence. On weekends, she visited local parks with Sophia, letting the baby soak in the sunshine. Slowly, a new rhythm emerged, a life that was far from the extravagance of her past, but filled with authentic, hard-won contentment. Support arrived from unexpected corners. Thomas Gallagher reached out, offering her a part-time position, managing the online presence of his philanthropic foundation. At first, Elizabeth hesitated. Thomas was, after all, a mutual friend of hers and Alexander's, but he insisted he simply wanted to help her get back on her feet and recognized her talent. Grateful for the opportunity, Elizabeth accepted. The position allowed her a degree of freedom. She could work remotely and still be a hands-on mother. Over time, she even saved enough money to upgrade to a slightly bigger apartment in a safer neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it boasted a tiny balcony where she could place potted plants and watch Sophia toddle around once she started walking. With these small triumphs, Elizabeth felt the sting of her heartbreak lessen. She still carried the scar of betrayal, yet she embraced each day with newfound strength and purpose. She no longer defined her worth by marriage or social status. The ring that once symbolized forever was tucked away in a box at the back of her closet, replaced by the joyful giggles of an infant discovering the world. Months passed before Elizabeth finally agreed to let Alexander see Sophia in a controlled setting, her lawyer's office. For a tense hour, Alexander cradled the infant while under the watchful gaze of both attorneys. Sophia, too young to understand the complexities, cooed and tugged at Alexander's tie, her innocent eyes full of wonder. Alexander's demeanor was subdued, a shell of the once arrogant tycoon. He apologized repeatedly, acknowledging his wrongdoings, begging for a chance to rectify his mistakes. Elizabeth remained stoic, responding only with carefully chosen words. She was determined to maintain her boundaries, reminding herself that illusions of contrition were easy to feign. Nevertheless, she couldn't deny the flicker of emotional turmoil as she witnessed father and daughter together. No matter how grave his betrayal, Alexander was still Sophia's father. Elizabeth wrestled with conflicting emotions, resentment for his deceit, pity for his remorse, and a lingering hope that he could one day be a positive force in Sophia's life. After the visit, Elizabeth permitted scheduled, supervised times for Alexander to see Sophia, always with a neutral third party present. It was a compromise that allowed him to bond with the child without encroaching too far into Elizabeth's space. Though she refused to look him in the eye when they traded polite greetings, part of her found solace in knowing that Sophia wouldn't grow up entirely without her father's presence. Alexander, in these sessions, revealed genuine tenderness. He brought stuffed animals, rattles, and even tried his hand at feeding the baby mashed bananas. With each visit, he seemed both grateful and sorrowful, acutely aware of the tenuous thread by which his fatherhood hung. Yet Elizabeth never let down her guard. She had learned the hard way that trust, once broken, was not easily mended. After a year of living apart, Elizabeth felt a newfound stability in her life. Sophia was now a chubby toddler, taking wobbly steps and gurgling half-formed words that filled the apartment with laughter. Elizabeth's consulting work grew into a small digital marketing agency, employing 2 part-time assistants. While she wasn't wealthy by any standard, she was comfortable enough to meet her needs, provide for Sophia, and occasionally indulge in small luxuries like a trip to the local aquarium or a new outfit for a special event. One day, Helen Russo handed Elizabeth a small envelope, explaining that it had been delivered to her old address. Inside, Elizabeth found an invitation to a charity gala, coincidentally the same annual event where she had first met Alexander. She hesitated, memories flooding back of that fateful night when she was just a hopeful young woman stepping into a glittering world. Confronting the memory of that evening stirred both nostalgia and sadness. But after discussing it with Helen, Elizabeth decided to attend. She wanted to show herself and the world that she wasn't defined by her divorce. Dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue gown, hair swept into a sleek bun, Elizabeth stepped into the grand ballroom with her head held high. She chatted confidently with former acquaintances, many of whom expressed surprise at how self-possessed she seemed, despite all she'd gone through. In attending the gala, Elizabeth realized she had healed more than she thought possible. She was no longer the naive girl, dazzled by wealth and status. Instead, she was a resilient mother and entrepreneur, someone who knew her own worth. And in that realization, she felt a chapter of her life finally begin to close. Shortly after Elizabeth's powerful return to the social scene, Alexander sought counseling for himself, a revelation that came to Elizabeth through a mutual contact. He had apparently started therapy to address his destructive habits, including the relentless pursuit of external validation and an inability to remain loyal. Word had it he also joined a men's support group aimed at helping individuals rebuild trust and mend damaged relationships. Though skeptical, Elizabeth found herself experiencing a complex range of emotions: anger, pity, and even a sliver of respect. She knew firsthand how difficult it could be to face one's demons. Alexander, once defined by hubris, seemed to be taking genuine steps towards self-improvement. But she maintained her distance, refusing to become emotionally invested in his transformation. She'd already given him her heart once, and that ended in betrayal. Meanwhile, Alexander insisted on more time with Sophia. After months of supervised visits, he politely asked if Elizabeth would allow him to take their daughter to a nearby park. He promised to have both the nanny and a friend accompany him. Torn, Elizabeth considered the request carefully. While she still bore scars, she also recognized that a healthy father-daughter bond could only flourish if Alexander were genuinely present in Sophia's life. Eventually, she agreed to a short outing. The first time Alexander arrived to pick up Sophia, he looked noticeably different, thinner, with lines of worry etched around his eyes, yet more humble. He spoke to Elizabeth with a gentle tone, expressing gratitude for her willingness to let him spend time with the child. She stayed inside, watching from behind the curtain as Alexander carefully buckled Sophia into her car seat. When he returned Sophia later that afternoon, Alexander handed Elizabeth a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, filled with apologies and a plea for forgiveness. He admitted every failing, acknowledging how he had neglected her needs and jeopardized their family. He vowed that while he understood she might never take him back, he would spend the rest of his life trying to become a man worthy of Sophia's respect and maybe, one distant day, Elizabeth's forgiveness. She read it alone in her bedroom, tears rolling silently, uncertain whether this letter could mend the past, but quietly acknowledging the sincerity behind his words. Time marched on. Elizabeth and Alexander officially divorced when Sophia was 2 years old. The custody agreement allowed Alexander limited but regular visitation every other weekend and some weekdays for dinner. Elizabeth stayed firm in her resolve to keep emotional distance, focusing on raising Sophia and growing her small agency. By the time Sophia turned 5, Elizabeth's business had expanded enough for her to hire 2 full-time employees and move into a small office space. She had carved out a respectable niche in digital marketing for non-profits and socially conscious brands. Alexander, on the other hand, went through a gradual but noticeable metamorphosis. Though he accepted financial assistance from his father to stabilize his business, he also focused on philanthropic ventures, donating to organizations that supported single mothers and families in crisis. Some saw it as a publicity stunt to rebuild his image, but those closest to him noted the genuine remorse and desire to give back. Sophia was the bridge between her parents. She adored both her mother and father, too young to understand the complexities of their past. Over the years, Elizabeth managed to cultivate a civil, if not warm, co-parenting relationship. She reminded herself that her personal hurt must not hinder Sophia's right to have a relationship with her father. With each passing year, Elizabeth felt her resentment thaw. While she would never forget the pain Alexander inflicted, she acknowledged that he was making a concerted effort to be a better father and a better man. And in her own life, she flourished, no longer the anxious wife trailing behind a tycoon, but a self-made professional with a bright future. When Sophia was 7, her school organized a father-daughter dance. Elizabeth, hesitant, worried about the emotional trigger this event might bring. But Sophia bubbled with excitement, showing Elizabeth the pink frilly dress she hoped to wear. She even asked if she could practice slow dancing in the living room. On the evening of the dance, Alexander arrived at Elizabeth's home to pick up Sophia, dressed in a tailored suit, holding a small bouquet of daisies for Sophia and a single rose for Elizabeth. He waited nervously at the doorstep. It was the first time he had come inside since their separation. The interior, decorated with warm lighting and personal touches, contrasted sharply with the cold grandeur of their former mansion. Elizabeth, wearing casual loungewear and minimal makeup, answered the door. She blinked in surprise at the rose he extended. "It's just a simple gesture," he said softly, "to thank you for raising such an incredible daughter." She felt an odd swell of emotion, gratitude, mixed with a distant echo of past hurts. But she forced a polite smile and accepted the flower, placing it in a vase on a nearby shelf. Sophia bounded down the stairs, radiant in her dress, and hugged Alexander's leg. He knelt to kiss her forehead, whispering, "You look like a princess." That night, Alexander and Sophia danced under the school gym lights, and Elizabeth discovered an unexpected ache in her chest, part regret, part relief, part acceptance. She found herself quietly hoping that Alexander's remorse was sincere enough to give Sophia the stable, loving father she deserved. After the dance, Alexander thanked Elizabeth again at the doorstep and turned to leave. On impulse, Elizabeth stopped him. "How was it?" she asked softly. "It was wonderful," he replied, voice trembling with emotion. For a moment their eyes locked, no longer as lovers, but as two people forever connected by a child, their histories intertwining with every new milestone. The door closed, and Elizabeth leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Sometimes closure doesn't come in a single moment. Sometimes It unfolds in a series of small, meaningful gestures over years. Over the next year, Alexander continued to show up for Sophia, never missing a scheduled visit, attending her school plays, cheering at her soccer matches. He seemed a fixture in her life, no longer the absent father chasing fleeting deals and fleeting pleasure. Elizabeth noticed that Sophia became more confident with both parents present in her everyday routine, a testament to Alexander's newfound consistency. Still, Elizabeth remained guarded. She recognized that no matter how genuine his efforts, the wounds of the past couldn't be erased. But a tentative friendship began to sprout. They exchanged polite texts about Sophia's school projects. They worked together on picking her birthday gifts, occasionally sharing a brief, nostalgic smile when their ideas overlapped. On a crisp Saturday morning, Alexander invited Elizabeth and Sophia to a community outreach event he was sponsoring. The local shelter needed volunteers to repaint its walls and refurbish the children's play area. Normally, Elizabeth would have declined any personal invitation from him, but she saw it as a chance to show Sophia the value of giving back. She accepted, and together they spent the day painting murals, handing out lunches, and chatting with families in need. During a break, while Sophia played with other kids, Elizabeth and Alexander found themselves painting side by side. Colors splashed across the wall in cheerful swirls. A comfortable silence settled between them. At one point, their eyes met over a can of paint, and Alexander ventured a soft, "Thank you for coming, for giving me this chance to do something good. With you and Sophia here, it means more than you realize." Elizabeth nodded, neither encouraging nor dismissing him. A flicker of understanding passed between them. It was a day of quiet revelations, the type that whisper that even the deepest scars can fade, given enough time, effort, and genuine remorse. In the years following Sophia's birth, Alexander had experienced adversity in nearly every dimension of his life: financial, emotional, personal. The once proud millionaire, who had reveled in extravagant parties and shallow affairs, was now a man shaped by humility and lessons learned the hard way. He often woke at dawn, driven by a desire to atone for his past misdeeds. In his therapy sessions, he confessed to feeling haunted by Elizabeth's tearful face whenever he closed his eyes. That memory of betraying her while she was pregnant, the person who had loved him unconditionally, tormented him. Every philanthropic donation, every volunteer day, every hour spent with Sophia was partly an act of conscience, a way to pay penance. Yet, deep down, Alexander feared that no matter how noble his actions now, nothing could undo his past. For Elizabeth, forgiveness wasn't an overnight process. She could see the changes in Alexander's character, an openness that was never there before, a willingness to be accountable. Occasionally, she dared to wonder if things might have been different had he recognized these truths sooner. But she also knew that clinging to what-ifs wouldn't serve her healing. She had built a life based on self-reliance and acceptance of her own worth. She wouldn't trade that growth for empty illusions of a rekindled romance. Yet, the reality remained. They were irrevocably tied by parenthood, and through that bond, glimmers of mutual respect and understanding emerged. Even if they couldn't be husband and wife, they could be civil partners in raising Sophia. And for now, that was enough. One breezy afternoon when Sophia was 9 years old, she asked Elizabeth a question that caught her off guard. "Mommy, why don't you and Daddy live together?" Elizabeth froze, her paintbrush mid-stroke on a craft project they'd been working on together. She had known this question would come eventually, but she wasn't prepared for how soon. Striving for honesty without overwhelming her child, Elizabeth explained that sometimes adults make mistakes that hurt each other deeply, and it can change how they live together. "But Daddy loves you very much," Elizabeth added, her voice steady, "and I love you too. We both always will." Sophia seemed to consider her mother's words carefully. With the innocence of a child, she asked, "Will you ever get married again?" The question tugged at Elizabeth's heart. She had avoided the topic of new relationships, still carrying wariness from her past. Gently, she answered, "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe one day, if I meet someone kind and trustworthy. But right now, I'm happy just being your mum." Later that evening, Elizabeth found herself thinking about the conversation. She realized that in all her efforts to protect Sophia from confusion, she had neglected her own emotional growth. While she had built a career and a stable home, she hadn't opened herself up to the possibility of love again. The walls she'd erected after Alexander's betrayal were thick. Part of her feared reliving that pain. Another part wondered if her independence was safer than taking another risk. In the following months, Elizabeth slowly allowed space for personal reflection. She met new people both in professional circles and through mutual friends. Occasionally, a spark of romance would flicker, but she remained cautious. What she discovered was that she no longer needed a partner for validation. She was comfortable in her own skin, aware of her strengths and limitations. As for Alexander, he continued down his path of redemption, staying devoted to Sophia, involving himself in community projects, and living a comparatively modest life. The once flashy cars and designer suits were replaced by practicality and simplicity. It was as if wealth had lost its luster. Through therapy, he came to understand that real riches lie in genuine human connection, trust, and love. He found solace in forging authentic relationships, not just transactional ones. One afternoon, after dropping Sophia off, he took a moment to talk to Elizabeth at her doorway. "I know I can't change the past," he said quietly. "But I want you to know I'm proud of who you've become. You're doing an amazing job with our daughter." Elizabeth nodded, a gentle sadness flickering behind her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile. For a moment, they simply stood there, two people stitched together by history and a child's future, sharing a mutual respect born of pain, regret, and cautious hope. Elizabeth's story is one of heartbreak and resilience, betrayal and renewal. She walked away from a millionaire husband who shattered her trust while she was pregnant with their daughter and rebuilt her life on a foundation of honesty and self-worth. Over the years, Alexander realized that his wealth and ambition meant nothing without the love and loyalty he'd taken for granted. Though he would regret his mistakes forever, his redemption lay in consistent action rather than empty words, and in embracing the chance to be a good father to Sophia. Their journey reminds us that healing is a process, not an event, and that true strength often emerges from the darkest trials. If you've been moved by Elizabeth's perseverance and Alexander's hard-won lessons, please like this video, share it with friends who may need inspiration, and subscribe to this channel for more real-life drama stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive.